I don't know how to start this, because no matter how I write it, no matter how many ways I try to break it down, none of it makes sense the way reality should. Time didn't work the way it was supposed to, the landscape wouldn't stay the same, and the deeper we went, the more the world around us felt less like a place and more like something watching, breathing, waiting. There were 5 of us, Emily, Jake, Sam, Olivia, and me, Ryan, and this was supposed to be just another hiking trip, one of many, something we'd done together every summer since college, a week in the mountains, off-grid, miles from civilization, nothing but trees and sky and the sound of wind through the branches, but it didn't take long for things to start feeling wrong, and I don't mean the usual bad gut feeling, I mean wrong. Like the forest was different from the one on the map, like the air itself was thicker, heavier, charged with something you could almost taste if you breathed too deep. There was a silence to it, not the peaceful kind, not the type that makes you feel small in a good way, but the kind that makes you realize just how far away you are from anyone who could hear you scream if something were to happen. It started the first night, when the fire was dying down and Jake went to grab more wood, vanishing into the darkness with nothing but his headlamp and a pocketknife, because it was routine, because we'd done it a dozen times before, but he came back different, quieter, distracted, eyes darting over his shoulder like he'd seen something he couldn't explain but wasn't ready to talk about yet, and when we asked what took him so long, he just said, "I found something weird." He led us maybe 20 yards past the edge of our camp, to a tree with a long, deep gash down the center, its bark torn open like something had clawed at it, not in the way a bear might, not in random, jagged streaks, but deliberate, parallel lines, like someone had dragged a set of knives through it with intent. The strangest part wasn't the marks, though, it was what had leaked from them, thick and dark, glistening in the glow of our headlamps, pooling slightly at the base of the trunk, coagulating into something that smelled too much like iron to be sap. We should have left right then and there, should have taken it as a sign, but none of us wanted to be the first to suggest it, because it was just a tree, right? A weird tree, a disturbing tree, but a tree all the same, and we weren't the kind of people who got scared off by something so small, so instead, we went back to camp, tossed another log on the fire, laughed it off, pretended it wasn't still there, 20 yards away, seeping, bleeding, watching. But I woke up in the middle of the night, no sound, no nightmare, nothing I could point to as the cause, just the kind of wakefulness that comes fast, sudden, the kind that makes every instinct in your body scream at you to be still, because something isn't right. And as I lay there, staring up at the shifting shadows cast by the fire's dying embers, I heard it, a slow, steady drip coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. I lay there, barely breathing, ears straining against the dark, and the sound was unmistakable, not the rustling of wind through leaves, not the settling of old wood, but something wet, something thick, something moving slow and steady in a rhythm too deliberate to be random, drip, 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 like water from a faucet that hadn't been shut off properly, except it wasn't water, because the smell that came with it was sharp, metallic, thick enough to coat the back of my throat even from where I was lying, something unmistakably wrong, something that didn't belong. I sat up carefully, scanning the campsite, Emily, Sam, Olivia, all asleep, bundled in their bags, undisturbed, while Jake's spot was empty, his pack still there but no sign of him, no sound of footsteps, just the fire reduced to glowing embers and that slow, rhythmic drip continuing somewhere just out of sight beyond the trees. I grabbed my flashlight, heart hammering, stepping carefully over the others as I moved toward the sound, past the dim circle of campfire light and into the darkness beyond, where the air felt colder, heavier, thick with something I couldn't explain, and that's when I saw him, Jake, standing in front of that same tree from earlier, the one with the slashes down its trunk, but now the gash was bigger, wider, as if something had split it open further from the inside, and Jake was just standing there, staring, his flashlight trained on the wound in the bark where the thick, black-red liquid still oozed out, slow and steady, forming a sticky pool around the roots. "It's still bleeding," he muttered, more to himself than to me, reaching out toward it before I could stop him, fingers barely grazing the surface of the sap, or blood, or whatever it was, before he jerked back with a sharp hiss of pain, his flashlight tumbling to the ground as he cradled his hand. "It burns," he choked out, shaking his fingers, and even in the weak light, I could see the raw, red welts already rising along his skin. We didn't talk as we backed away, as I grabbed his dropped flashlight and shut it off, as we hurried back to camp without looking over our shoulders, without acknowledging the way the dripping hadn't stopped, without speaking about how, just before I turned my light away, I swore I saw the edges of that wound shifting, pulsing, breathing like something alive. We didn't talk, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing, the same unspoken realization that was settling into my bones like ice. This wasn't normal, this wasn't something we could explain away, because I know what sap looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, and that wasn't sap. That was blood. That was something alive. And whatever it belonged to, it was still here. We didn't sleep much after that, not really, just lay there with our eyes closed, listening, pretending, waiting for the first hint of morning, but even when the sky finally lightened, the air stayed wrong, thick and heavy, like the night had never fully ended, like the darkness was still clinging to the trees, refusing to let go. Jake's hand was worse in the daylight, the welts now raised, angry red, spreading toward his wrist in thin, branching lines that almost looked like roots crawling beneath his skin, but he waved me off when I suggested turning back, wouldn't even let Emily see, just shoved his hands into his pockets and said, "Let's keep moving," like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just seen something we couldn't explain, and maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was something else, but none of us argued. We packed up fast, left camp in silence, followed the trail deeper into the trees, but the deeper we went, the worse it got, because that silence. It wasn't normal. No birds, no insects, no wind shifting the leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path, the rhythmic rustling of our packs, the occasional snap of a twig breaking underfoot, but nothing else, nothing natural, and the farther we walked, the more it felt like something was waiting, watching, shifting just beyond the edges of our vision, hiding between the trees where the light didn't reach. At first, I thought it was just me, that I was letting my nerves get to me, that my brain was filling in gaps that weren't there, but then Olivia spoke up, quiet, hesitant, like she didn't really want to say it out loud. "Has anyone else noticed the trees?" We stopped, turned to look where she was pointing, and that's when I realized what had been wrong this whole time, not just the silence, not just the air, but the trees themselves, because these weren't the same trees we'd been walking through before. The trunks were different, darker, twisted, bark rough and peeling like something had been crawling underneath it, shifting, reshaping, rearranging when we weren't looking, and the worst part. The trail had narrowed, the path that had been wide enough for all of us to walk side by side now barely wide enough for two, the trees pressing in close, too close, their gnarled roots curling over the dirt like fingers, like they were reaching for us. I turned, looked back the way we came, expecting to see the familiar stretch of trail behind us, expecting to be able to follow our own footprints back to camp, but there was nothing. Just trees, thick and endless, stretching in every direction. The trail was gone. Emily was the first to move, stepping forward with that forced confidence she always had when things got tense, pulling out the map and turning in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the sky, anything that might help, but the second she looked back at us, I already knew, nothing lined up, the terrain didn't match, the trail we had followed was just gone, swallowed up by the forest like it had never been there to begin with, and before anyone could say what we were all thinking, before the creeping realization could set in that we weren't just lost, that something was wrong, Jake let out a sharp breath, muttered, "What the hell is that?" and pointed to a tree just ahead of us, half hidden in the shadows, a thick, gnarled thing with deep scars in its bark, but not random ones, not from animals or weather or time. These marks were carved, deliberate, something slashed into the surface with a blade, long, jagged strokes forming a twisted shape we didn't recognize, but it wasn't just that, wasn't just the carving, because wedged into the center of it, half buried in the bark like the tree had started to swallow it, was a hunting knife, old and rusted, handle wrapped in faded, rotten leather, but the second I stepped closer, I saw what I shouldn't have seen, what made every inch of me go still, because the handle, someone had scratched words into it, deep enough to be permanent, and even though time had worn them down, even though the letters were warped, misshapen, I could still read them, could still make out the warning that shouldn't have been there, that didn't make sense, that made my stomach turn because it meant someone had been here before us, had seen what we were seeing, had known, do not bleed. Nobody touched the knife, nobody spoke, we just stood there staring at it, at the words carved into the handle, at the deep slashes in the bark, at the way the tree itself seemed to breathe around the metal like it had been lodged there for years but was still being consumed, and then Olivia whispered, "What time is it?" And it should have been a simple question, an easy answer, but when we all checked our watches, our phones, our GPS, nothing made sense. Jake's watch said 2:13 p.m., mine said 6:47 a.m., Sam's GPS still read 11:26 a.m., frozen on the time we had checked it that morning, and Emily's phone screen had gone black completely, refusing to turn on no matter how many times she pressed the button, and that was when I realized the light had changed, that the sun, which had been high in the sky just minutes before, had somehow shifted, now lower, dimmer, the shadows stretching in the wrong direction like time had skipped forward or backward without us noticing, like the day itself was breaking apart, and then Olivia's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time, her breathing uneven, panicked, "Where's the trail?" And we turned, all at once, eyes scanning the ground, searching for the familiar path we had followed for hours, but it was gone, completely gone, the dirt packed down from our footsteps now nothing but untouched forest floor, the footprints we had left behind erased, the trees standing closer than before, their trunks thick, gnarled, twisted together like they had been growing for centuries, closing in around us, reshaping the landscape, trapping us inside something that was no longer just a forest, no longer just trees, no longer something that should exist. We moved fast after that, pushing forward in the direction we thought was north, but the forest had no sense of direction anymore, no markers, no landmarks, just an endless maze of trees that seemed to shift when we weren't looking, closing gaps, narrowing spaces, pressing in like a living thing that wanted us to keep moving but wouldn't let us out, and after what felt like hours, when our legs were aching and the light in the sky hadn't changed, when the silence had become so thick it felt like sound itself had been drained from the air, we found it, an abandoned campsite, half buried under leaves, forgotten by time but not untouched, with a rusted fire pit, a collapsed tent, a backpack that had long since been split open by animals or something else, and a water bottle still standing upright next to it, covered in moss but full, as if it had just been placed there yesterday, and then we saw the journal, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting fabric, its pages yellowed, edges curling with moisture, but the second Emily picked it up, the second she turned to the first page, my stomach clenched because I could see the handwriting, could see the messy scrawl, the frantic pen strokes, the words scratched in uneven lines, desperate, familiar, and as she started reading, as her face went pale, as the others leaned in, I felt my pulse hammer in my skull because I already knew, I knew what it would say, and then she read the first line aloud in a voice that wasn't hers anymore, a voice that belonged to something small, frantic, hopeless. "If you're reading this, you're already dead." The journal wasn't old enough, shouldn't have been as decayed as it was, shouldn't have looked like it had been sitting there for decades when the ink on the pages was still dark, the words still clear, still wet in places where the writer had pressed too hard, dragged the pen too quickly, where the frantic loops and jagged letters looked like they had been scratched down in the dark by someone who knew they didn't have much time left. And as Emily flipped through it, as we saw page after page of our names written over and over, of entries describing places we had just passed, things we had just seen, warnings we hadn't heeded, the trees move when you don't look, don't let it touch you, do not bleed, Olivia made a sound low in her throat, a choked whisper that barely made it past her lips before she dropped her pack, hands trembling, shoving her sleeves up to her elbows, revealing something none of us had noticed before, deep, thin scratches covering her arms, raw and red like something with sharp, deliberate fingers had been reaching for her in the night, and before we could say anything, before we could react, before any of it could make sense, she turned her wrist toward us, her breath coming short and quick, pointing at a fresh wound just below her palm, a single shallow cut she swore she hadn't made, but that wasn't the worst part, wasn't the part that sent ice flooding through my veins, because as I stepped closer, as I looked at the cut, at the way the skin around it had darkened, turned grayish, almost waxy, I saw something move under her skin, something slow, something thin, something curling like a root burrowing deeper. We didn't speak, didn't breathe, just stared at Olivia's arm, at the way the skin beneath the cut twitched, something shifting just under the surface, slow and unnatural, like whatever had gotten inside her wasn't blood or infection or anything human, but something alive, something that was growing, something that wasn't supposed to be there, and then the air around us changed, thickened, the silence deepened into something pressing, something crushing, like a held breath that wasn't ours, and when Sam finally moved, reaching into his pack, yanking out a roll of gauze, hands shaking as he tried to wrap Olivia's wrist, the trees around us shifted, not swaying, not bending, but moving, trunks groaning, bark cracking, the path behind us narrowing as branches stretched downward, roots curled upward, closing in, closing around, and when Emily spun to look in the direction we had come, the way we had just walked, her flashlight beam caught the pathway disappearing, dirt vanishing beneath. Curling roots, leaves pressing together to form an unbroken wall of bark, and then Jake, who had been silent, too silent, who had been staring at nothing since we found the journal, spoke, voice hoarse, not his voice anymore, muttering, "We weren't supposed to find it," and when I turned to him, when I really looked at him, at the way his skin had gone pale, at the way his pupils had dilated, at the way his fingernails were starting to turn black, I realized what we should have known hours ago. Maybe even days ago, maybe since the moment we stepped off the trail and found that first bleeding tree, we had already gone too far, and the forest was never going to let us leave. Jake swayed where he stood, head tilting at an unnatural angle, eyes unfocused, lips slightly parted like he was listening to something just out of reach, something none of us could hear, and before I could step toward him, before I could grab his arm, he collapsed, body hitting the ground hard enough to kick up dirt, fingers twitching against the forest floor as a sharp, wet gasp ripped from his throat, and then his leg jerked, a sudden, violent movement that sent him sprawling onto his back. And that's when we saw it, the gash just above his ankle, deep and glistening, not from a fall, not from a rock or a branch, but from something else, something deliberate, like a cut, a wound that hadn't been there seconds ago, and the second the blood touched the ground, the air shifted, the trees shuddered, the roots moved, curling toward the crimson soaking into the dirt like something hungry, something feeding, something waking up, and then, the sound, a deep, resonant vibration, not quite a growl, not quite a voice, but something between the two, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, rolling through the trees in a low, rhythmic pulse that I could feel in my bones, like the forest itself was reacting, like something beneath the earth had just taken a breath after lying dormant for far too long, and Jake, his back arched, body seizing, mouth opening wide but no scream coming out, just silence, just his fingers digging into the dirt, just his eyes rolling back, just the veins in his neck standing out like something inside him was being pulled away, and that's when Sam grabbed my arm, fingers tight, nails digging in hard enough to hurt, voice raw and terrified in a way I had never heard before, "We have to go. Now." We ran, no plan, no direction, just tearing through the trees, boots sinking into the loose, pulsing soil, lungs burning, branches clawing at our faces as the sound of Jake's body thrashing behind us grew wet, unnatural, like something pulling him apart, but I didn't look back, didn't let myself see what was happening to him, because something told me if I did, if I turned for even a second, I wouldn't keep running, wouldn't be able to move, wouldn't be able to do anything except watch, and then Olivia stumbled, barely catching herself on a low-hanging branch, her breathing ragged, too fast, too wrong, and I saw the way her fingers tightened around the bark, not like she was steadying herself, but like she was gripping it too hard, like she couldn't let go, like something beneath her skin was reacting to the trees, and when she lifted her head, when her eyes met mine, I saw it, just for a second, a flicker of something not her, something deep, dark, hollow stretching behind her pupils, and before I could say anything, before I could reach for her, Sam was screaming, stumbling back from something just ahead of us, hands shaking, mouth opening and closing around words he couldn't force out, and when I followed his gaze, I saw why, bodies, half buried in the tree trunks, faces twisted in frozen screams, skin pulled tight over bone, their limbs stretching into branches, their torsos merging with the bark, their eyes still open, their mouths gaping as if they had been screaming even as the trees consumed them, and one of them moved, not much, just a slow twitch of a finger, a flutter of an eyelid, but enough to tell me that they weren't just remains, weren't just memories of something that had happened long ago, they were still alive. Sam was still making that awful sound, that raw, broken noise that wasn't quite a scream but wasn't anything human either, just breath and fear and something cracking apart inside him, and Emily was shaking him, gripping his arms, telling him to move, to run, but I wasn't looking at them anymore, wasn't hearing them, because the bodies in the trees were whispering, mouths barely moving, lips dry and cracked, voices leaking out in thin, reedy gasps like the words were being forced through lungs that had long since collapsed, and I couldn't understand them, couldn't make out the sounds at first, just a chorus of murmurs, overlapping, chaotic, but then one of them, a man, or what had once been a man, his face stretched into something long and hollow, his ribs visible through the bark like the tree had grown around him, through him, turned his head just enough to look at me, and when he spoke, his voice crawled into my ears like something physical, something wet and cold and wrong, and I understood him, understood all of them, because they were saying the same thing, over and over, not begging for help, not screaming in agony, not warning us to leave, but something worse, something far worse, because they were praying, chanting, pleading, not to be saved, but to be taken completely, to be finished, to be swallowed whole, and when I staggered back, when I finally tore my gaze away from them, when I grabbed Olivia's arm and tried to pull her with me, her skin was hot, feverish, damp, and the veins along her wrist were turning black, spreading up toward her elbow, twisting, stretching, deepening, pulsing like something alive was slithering inside them, and when her lips parted, I thought she was going to scream, thought she was going to cry out, but she didn't, she just smiled, slow, sluggish, wrong, and the voice that came out of her mouth wasn't hers. I don't know if it was Olivia speaking or something inside her, something twisting through her blood, something sinking its roots into her marrow, but when her mouth moved, when the sound came out, it was deep, wet, crawling, layered, like more than one voice was using her throat, overlapping and distorted, not human anymore, and the words, we had heard them before, scratched into the hunting knife, scrawled in the journal, whispered in the trees, do not bleed. I tried to pull her, tried to shake her, but her body wouldn't move the way it should, her limbs too stiff, her fingers curling inward like she was hardening, like something was reshaping her from the inside, and then Emily grabbed my shoulder, fingernails digging deep, breath coming too fast, too ragged, because she had found something, something half buried beneath the leaves at the base of the whispering bodies, something old and warped with age but not rotted, something that should have fallen apart but was still whole, a stone altar, its surface slick with something dark, something thick, something that had seeped into the cracks over decades, maybe centuries, maybe longer, and at the center of it, half covered in moss, a bowl, shallow and waiting, rim carved with the same symbols we had seen on the trees, on the knife, on Olivia's arms, and in the bottom of the bowl, teeth, human teeth, some yellowed with age, some too fresh, too clean, like they had just been left there, and Sam, who had been silent since we saw the bodies, who had been standing too still, too empty, took a single step forward, knelt by the altar, and placed his fingers against the stone like he had done it before, like he had always known it was there, and when he lifted his head, when his lips moved, I already knew what he was going to say, because I had heard it before, because we had all heard it before, because it had been waiting for us to understand, only one can leave. The forest was breathing, the trees shifting, the whispering bodies pressing closer, their voices rising, overlapping, not words anymore but a low, droning hum, deep enough to shake the ground, to vibrate in my skull, in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones, and Sam, his hands were still on the altar, his fingertips pressing into the slick stone like he could feel something beneath it, something moving, something waiting. And when he looked up at us, when his mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile but too empty, too stretched, too wrong, I knew he wasn't with us anymore, not really, because his eyes were black, not dark, not shadowed, but empty, pupils swallowed whole by something vast, something hollow, something that had always been here, and when he spoke, when his lips parted, the words came out too slow, too careful, too deliberate, like they were being pulled from someplace far away, like they were being given to him instead of coming from him. It has to be one of us. Emily moved first, lunging toward him, hands gripping his shoulders, shaking him, yelling something that didn't matter because he wasn't listening, because he wasn't Sam anymore, not really, and Olivia, God, Olivia, her arms had darkened, the veins black now, curling up toward her shoulders, her breath coming too slow, too deep, her lips parting like she was hearing something we weren't, and the trees, they were moving now, pressing closer, the roots crawling over the ground, shifting under our feet, and when I turned, when I spun toward the path, toward where the path should have been, there was nothing but forest, nothing but hunger, nothing but a presence, an intelligence, an awareness wrapping around us like a net tightening, like a mouth closing, like it had already decided who was going to stay. The moment stretched, the air thick with something almost solid, pressing into my ears, my throat, my skull, the hum from the trees rising into a vibration that rattled my ribs, a heartbeat that didn't belong to any of us, and then Sam moved, slow at first, deliberate, fingers dragging over the altar, tracing the carved symbols, his lips parting like he was about to speak, like he was about to say something none of us wanted to hear. And then his head snapped up, eyes locking onto mine, pupils still swallowed by that impossible blackness, and his mouth curled into something not human, something hollow, something stretched too wide, and before I could react, before I could process, he lunged at Emily, hands closing around her wrist, dragging her toward the altar, toward the bowl full of teeth, toward whatever had taken Jake, Olivia, all of them, and she fought, twisting, kicking, screaming, but he was too strong, too fast. No longer Sam, and I don't know what made me do it, don't know. If it was instinct or desperation or something that had already decided I wasn't the one who was meant to stay, but my hands found the hunting knife, the one we had pulled from the tree, the one marked with the words "Do not bleed," and before I could think, before I could hesitate, before I could question what the hell I was doing, I drove it into his side, deep, twisting, feeling the resistance, feeling something inside him give. And for a second, just a second, his body jerked, his mouth opened. In something almost like a scream but not quite, and then the trees shook, the roots split, the ground beneath us buckled, and suddenly the forest was moving, not closing in, not trapping us, but pushing us out, and Emily, she grabbed my wrist, yanked me forward, yanked me into a dead sprint, and we ran, Sam's voice splitting apart behind us, not words anymore but something deeper, something ancient, something laughing, and then, suddenly, we were out, we were back, the trees behind us. Frozen, silent, the sky overhead wrong, a shade darker than it should have been, and when I turned, when I forced myself to look, when I stared back into the place that should have killed us, the place that should have kept us, I saw them, figures standing between the trees, dozens, maybe hundreds, all watching, all waiting, all whispering our names. We didn't stop running until the forest was gone behind us, until the air felt thinner, lighter, until the trees were normal again, until the whispers faded into something distant, something almost imagined, but the second we crossed the tree line, the second we stumbled back into the world that should have been safe, I knew, it wasn't over, not really, not ever, because Emily was still gripping my wrist too hard, her breathing too ragged, her skin too pale, and when I turned to her, when I looked her in the eyes, I saw it, that flicker of black, that hollow, stretching darkness that hadn't been there before, that didn't belong to her, and she must have seen something on my face, must have known, because she took a single step back, shook her head, mouthed something I couldn't hear, and then she was gone, bolting toward the road, disappearing between the trees, leaving me standing there, alone, staring at the empty space where she had been. And when I looked down at my hands, at the smears of dirt and blood, at the torn edge of my sleeve where something had touched me, I felt it, a pulse that wasn't mine, a slow, deep movement under my skin, like something burrowing, something growing, something waiting, and when I turned back toward the forest, when I stared into the shifting dark, into the shapes that still stood between the trees, I realized what they had meant, what they had always meant, what we had never understood, because the forest doesn't just take, doesn't just consume, doesn't just kill, it spreads.